Thanks for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, 12 million victims since 1994. Hundreds of Congolese women march in protest against the international community, who they accuse of hypocrisy over its response to deepening conflict in the east of the country. Also, Nigeria calls for a trio of people to be added to Interpol's watch list for allegedly forging the signature of an ex-president to steal over $6 million in cash from the central bank before fleeing the country. And love is certainly not kept under wraps in Zimbabwe for Valentine's Day. Harare is overrun by squads of saxophonists delivering love notes. But first, in the DR Congolese capital of Kinshasa on Wednesday, hundreds of women protested years of violence in the east that has led to presumably millions of victims of attacks from militant groups over the decades. Recently, fighting has flared up between government forces and M23 rebels around Goma, forcing thousands of civilians to flee. Rwanda's been accused by the UN of supporting the M23. Demonstrators accused the international community of doing little, though, to hold their neighbour to account.
We condemn the complicity of the international community, represented by the USA, France, Belgium, the United Kingdom and Poland, in siding with our oppressors. We are concerned about the subhuman conditions in which our compatriots in the East live, where large families are constantly on the move, women and girls are raped, stripped of their possessions and means of living and surviving.
Well, clashes have recently intensified around the town of Sake, not far from Goma, which is the capital of the war-torn North Kivu region. Emmett Livingston is there.
So the situation at the moment in Goma and on the outskirts of Goma, it has to be said, is still unclear. There are ongoing artillery battles happening along the road leading from Sake to Goma, but to what extent the M23 has actually advanced isn't clear. It's obviously a no-go zone because it's an active war zone. What is clear, however, is that the M23 descended from strategic positions that they held in hills above the town of Sake, and there was fighting recently in the town of Sake, and that itself is considered a dramatic escalation. And I was on the road to Sake today and also yesterday, and you can see a constant stream of troops, both Congolese troops, irregular militia that are supporting the Congolese, and regional troops from South Africa and from Malawi and from Tanzania who are speeding to the front, often with artillery pieces trailing behind them.
So despite this military presence from, neighbouring countries supporting DR Congo's battle against M23, you were telling me earlier that you got the sense that somehow the civilians were being forgotten in the midst of this. Why do you feel that way from what you've seen?
Certainly. So what has to be understood is that along the road to Sake, there are, I don't know the exact number, but certainly maybe a dozen displacement camps. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of people. These are people who have already fled fighting in the area behind Sake, so in the Masisi region, who fled towards Goma, towards safety. And now, in effect, they are trapped in a kettle. They have Goma behind them. They have the park above them, which is full of militia groups. And on the road to Sake, there is a conflict. And the conflict is happening there on that road. So there are artillery positions just hundreds of meters from these camps. And when you're inside the camps, there is a constant stream of artillery fire. And obviously this is leading to deaths among civilians and among displaced people. I also visited a hospital for war wounded in Goma today, and the doctors told me that they're receiving between 20 and 30 cases every day of civilians as well as combatants who are essentially blown to bits by artillery pieces, by artillery shells.
Have you seen any evidence of that frustration that we have seen being expressed in Kinshasa by those protesters who say that DR Congo's partners aren't doing enough to hold who they believe to be responsible for supporting the M23 to account? Do you see that reflected in the civilians that you've been encountering in Goma?
Strangely enough, I don't. And it's an odd thing to perceive as an outsider, but many of the displaced people, especially, are paradoxically calm. And the impression I get is that they are caught up in a situation that is not of their own making, and they are just hoping that the violence stops. And in fact, if you talk to them, that is the only thing they say. They just want the violence to stop. They want to go back to their villages. They don't want to be hit with artillery shells, and they don't want to have to flee. There's very little of this sense that outsiders are responsible for this conflict beyond Rwanda that you find in Kinshasa, certainly. And I think in Kinshasa, a lot of it may be driven by social media narratives. Whereas if you were living in the situation in Eastern Congo, you're right up against it and you can see who's firing the bullets and who's firing the shells. So I think there's a slightly different understanding of where responsibility lies.
And so why do you feel that in Kinshasa there is so much frustration against the international community when so many believe that it is Rwanda who is behind supporting the M23?
So I think the feeling in Kinshasa doesn't come from nowhere. The international community, in the eyes of Congolese government officials, does bear some responsibility for this conflict in that they haven't sanctioned Rwanda. And the Congolese government has spent the better part of 2 years trying to rally international support for sanctions against Rwanda, and those haven't been forthcoming. So I think there's a sense of abandonment, both from the government and from a lot of people who are following this situation from afar.
Emmett Livingston there speaking to me from Goma a little earlier on. Now, Nigeria has asked Interpol to arrest 3 people suspected of forging the signature of ex-President Muhammadu Buhari to steal $6.2 million in cash from the central bank. The trio are accused of having worked with former bank chief Godwin Emefiele, who's currently on trial, facing 20 corruption-related charges. Sam Olokoya tells us more.
A court in the Nigerian capital, Abuja, has been told how the signature of a sitting president was forged, leading to the fraudulent withdrawal of more than $6 million from the central bank. Godwin Emefiele, the former governor of the central bank, and 3 others are accused of conniving to perpetrate this crime. The money was said to have been withdrawn from the account of the central bank under the guise of being authorized for disbursement to election observers before former President Muhammadu Buhari left office. Boss Mustafa, a senior official that served the regime of the former president, told the court that Mr. Buhari did not sign the correspondence authorizing the central bank to release the money. He said the former president's signature was forged. Mr. Mustafa, who was secretary to the government of the Federation during the Buhari regime, added that the language and content of the correspondence were different from those used for the former president's official correspondence. This is one of 20 charges of corruption the former central bank governor is facing. If this particular charge is proven against him, it will further highlight how the lack of proper official regulation make it easy for public officials to steal large sums of public funds.
Sam Olokoya there for us. Now, amidst Senegal's deepening political crisis over the decision to postpone presidential elections due this month, calls are mounting for an investigation into fatal crackdowns on protests. 3 died during rallies in the southern city of Ziguinchor last week, and their families are demanding justice. Our team sent us this report.
Friends, family and local officials gathered outside Landing Camara's house on Tuesday evening. The 16-year-old boy was killed here in the southern city of Ziguinchor as the police cracked down on protests last week.
To hear that a young man from the neighborhood was killed by the police who are supposed to protect the population is truly shocking. Those who committed these acts must be judged. They must pay for this.
The human rights organization Amnesty International estimates that at least 60 people have been killed in protests in Senegal since March 2021.
They use live rounds against protesters. This is an inappropriate and disproportionate use of force. We have arrived at a point today where the Senegalese government has taken the country to the same level as the most repressive regimes on the African continent. The courts haven't investigated a single death from all the cases between 2021 and 2024.
The government insists that justice will be served.
There must be inquiries to determine who killed who. Just because there are police who are armed doesn't mean that these are the ones who do the shooting. We need to remain rational. The Senegalese government wants transparency and justice, but there has to be a proper process if we want true clarity.
As discontent grows after the presidential election was delayed, ECOWAS, France and the United States have called for Senegalese authorities to show restraint.
Well, finally, it is Valentine's Day, and Zimbabweans in Harare ramped up the sax appeal. Rather than sending sweet notes of love to objects of their affection, local tradition has led to couples sharing a range of different kinds of notes. Take a look.
Cards, chocolate or flowers, Valentine's Day is celebrated in Zimbabwe like in any other parts of the world. And even with the economic hardship, love and money can go hand in hand. In a country where hyperinflation has rendered local currency all but worthless, the flower arrangements are often intertwined with high-value US dollar bills. But Zimbabwe is adding its own little twist. This musician has been hired by lawyer Tarisai Looba's husband to serenade her. But first, a bouquet of roses and money with 500 worth of dollar bills. The surprise has been a success.
And I wasn't expecting it, but I love him. I love him. I love him a lot, and I really appreciate this.
Saxophonists are fully booked for Valentine's Day to surprise a loved one.
Looking at it being something new in Zim, like people are using it to surprise their people on birthdays, their wives, and probably like this Valentine's, everyone is going to be surprising everyone who they love. So yeah, everyone is kind of looking for the saxophone, and they want saxophonists to deliver their gift all over the country. And yeah, I think it's a good vibe. Yes, it's overwhelming.
Musicians can charge between $60 and $200, a small fortune in Zimbabwe's inflation-haunted economy, which prove that love has no price.
Raising the bar once again. That is, though, all we have time for Eye on Africa. Thanks for joining us, though, and do so again if you can. Till then, take care.